The night air was warm and smelled like roses and expensive perfume. The chandeliers above the ballroom threw golden light across polished floors, and laughter echoed through the house I had designed myself. It was supposed to be a night of pride, Grant's big party, celebrating his company's latest success. Our home, our work, our life together. At least, that's what I used to believe. I stood near the marble staircase, holding a glass of champagne that had already gone flat. The guests, investors, board members, their wives, moved around like a scene from a magazine. Everywhere I looked, Grant was in the center of it all, his charm effortless, his smile sharp. I had watched him practice that smile for years, the one that made people trust him, the one that had once made me fall in love. When I saw her, I knew instantly who she was. Celine Ward. The whispers had reached me weeks ago, her name said softly by employees who didn't know I was listening. She was younger, perfectly styled, her laughter bright enough to pull attention from every corner of the room. She moved through the crowd like she owned it, and somehow, everyone let her. I told myself to stay calm, to act like the wife of the man who hosted the party, not the woman who already knew too much. I took a slow sip of my drink and tried to blend into the background. But fate, or maybe pride, didn't let that happen. Celine stopped right in front of me, her red dress shimmering under the lights. Her eyes skimmed over me the way someone looks at an old piece of furniture they plan to replace. She smiled, sweet, practiced, poisonous. "That's a lovely dress," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut. Then, louder, for everyone nearby to hear, she added, "Vintage, right? How charitable of you." A few people laughed, unsure whether to join her cruelty or avoid the tension. My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. I looked at Grant, who was standing just a few feet away. He met my eyes for a moment, then looked away, chuckling along with the others. The sound hit me harder than her words ever could. It wasn't just that he didn't defend me, it was that he enjoyed the scene. He wanted her laughter more than he wanted my dignity. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Celine," I said quietly. "It takes confidence to appreciate real value." She blinked, not sure if she'd been insulted, and turned back toward Grant. He draped his arm around her waist without hesitation. The room started to spin, not from the champagne but from the realization that everything I had built, every part of my life that had once felt solid, was cracking in plain sight. I put down my glass on the nearest table and straightened my shoulders. I didn't cry. I didn't cause a scene. I walked outside, the sound of laughter fading behind me, and promised myself that this would be the last time anyone, especially him, would ever laugh at my expense again. 12 years ago, Grant wasn't the man people saw on magazine covers or speaking on big stages. He was just a man with tired eyes, big dreams, and a desk that barely held together. I met him when I was hired to design the interior of his first office, an old, drafty space above a coffee shop. He couldn't afford much, but he had ideas, and his excitement was contagious. I liked that about him. He talked about creating something that would change lives, and I wanted to help him do it. At the time, I was working small design jobs, barely making enough to cover rent. But with Grant, it felt like we were building something bigger than either of us. We stayed late most nights, sketching ideas, moving furniture, eating cheap takeout on the floor. Sometimes, we'd fall asleep at our desks and wake up laughing about it. He used to look at me like I was his lucky break. When his company, Hollister Innovations, started to take shape, he ran into a problem. He needed funding. Banks didn't take him seriously, and investors thought his plan was too risky. I didn't have much, but I believed in him. I took out a second mortgage on my small house and gave him everything I could. He tried to refuse at first, saying he couldn't take that kind of risk with someone else's money. But I told him it wasn't just his dream anymore, it was ours. Those early years were hard. There were months when we weren't sure if we'd make payroll or even pay the rent. We'd eat ramen noodles and laugh about how someday we'd look back and say it was worth it. And when he finally landed his first big client, we celebrated with a cheap bottle of wine on the office floor, like it was the finest thing in the world. I can still remember how proud he looked that night. As the company grew, so did our life together. We got married in a small garden behind a bed and breakfast. He wore a gray suit that didn't quite fit, and I wore a simple dress I'd designed myself. He promised me that no matter how big his dreams became, he'd never forget who helped him build them. For a long time, I believed that promise. The turning point came quietly. The more successful he became, the less he looked at me the same way. Meetings replaced dinners, and I started sleeping alone more often. He began talking to me like an employee instead of a partner. I told myself it was stress, that it would pass once things settled down. But it didn't. It only got worse. When the company finally exploded in value, Grant changed. He started wearing custom suits, talking about power, image, and perception. He surrounded himself with people who praised him, and I became invisible in the crowd. The man who once thanked me for believing in him now acted like I was just another part of his past, something he'd outgrown. And yet, even as I watched him drift away, I still hoped that the man I once knew was buried somewhere beneath the ego and the ambition. I didn't realize then that the person I fell in love with no longer existed. It began with little things, the kind that don't scream betrayal but whisper it. Grant started taking his phone everywhere, even into the shower. He'd turn the screen away from me when messages came in, and if I asked who it was, he'd sigh, saying it was work. His tone carried that sharp edge that made me feel foolish for even asking. He began leaving early for meetings that never appeared on his calendar and coming home late, smelling faintly of a perfume I didn't wear. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself he was just under pressure. The company was growing fast, and stress had changed the way he handled things. But something about his distance felt different. His eyes stopped meeting mine. Conversations turned short and careful, like he was afraid of saying too much. When I asked if something was wrong, he laughed it off. "You're imagining things," he said once, not even looking up from his phone. "You should be grateful for the life I've built for us." The words stung more than I expected. It wasn't the first time he said I instead of we, but it was the first time it sounded like a warning. I stopped pushing. I watched instead. I noticed he changed his passwords, started paying for things with cash, and suddenly had business trips that appeared out of nowhere. He always left on Fridays and came back late Sundays, exhausted but strangely cheerful. I'd ask how the meetings went, and he'd answer with vague words: productive, necessary, strategic. He never said where he'd been. The nights he was home, he slept with his phone on silent, screen down. One night, while he was in the shower, it lit up on the dresser. The name on the screen was saved under CW Consulting. I stared at it for a moment before the light faded. My chest tightened, but I didn't open it. I wasn't ready to know. Days later, when I was cleaning his car, I found a folded receipt tucked between the seat and the console. It was from a luxury hotel downtown, 2 nights, a suite with a balcony. My hands started shaking when I read the name printed under guest. Celine Ward. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind went blank, like every part of me refused to accept what was right in front of me. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring at that piece of paper, and felt something inside me quietly break. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I placed the receipt in an envelope and hid it in my desk drawer. Over the next few weeks, I started keeping records, bank statements, emails, his travel dates. Every time he lied, I wrote it down. I wanted proof. Not because I planned to expose him right away, but because I needed to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that what I felt was real. Each note I made was like a small crack in the wall of our marriage, one that couldn't be patched again. By the time I finished, I wasn't the same woman who used to defend him. I was someone waiting for the right moment to stop pretending everything was fine. Celine didn't stay in the shadows for long. What began as whispers and secret meetings turned into her appearing beside Grant in public like she had earned the right to be there. At first, she'd attend company events as a consultant, always introduced with a bright smile and a handshake that lingered just long enough to make people uncomfortable. But soon, she didn't need introductions. She acted like she belonged, because Grant let her. At every event, I watched her glide through crowds with practiced confidence. She knew when to laugh, when to touch his arm, when to stand close enough that no one questioned who she really was. I started noticing how people looked at me with quiet pity, their smiles a little too polite. No one said anything out loud, but I could read the truth in their eyes. They all knew. I was the wife being replaced, and they were just waiting to see how long I'd pretend not to notice. When I asked Grant about her presence, he brushed it off like it was nothing. "Celine handles client relations," he said, pouring himself a drink. "She's good at what she does." I tried to keep my voice steady. "She's not part of the company," I reminded him. He didn't even look at me when he answered. "She is now." That was the first time I realized I wasn't just losing him. I was being erased piece by piece. The woman who once helped build his business was being quietly replaced by someone younger, someone who made him feel powerful. I started skipping events just to avoid the humiliation. But there was one night I couldn't avoid, the charity gala his company sponsored every year. The room shimmered with gold lights and designer gowns. I wore a simple black dress, classic and quiet. When I entered, Grant was already there with Celine by his side, her laughter echoing above the music. She looked at home, like she'd been waiting for that moment her entire life. I tried to keep my focus anywhere but on them, but when I turned to greet an old investor, I froze. Around her neck hung a necklace I would have recognized anywhere, the one I had designed and given to Grant our first Christmas together. It was made from rose gold, with a small diamond set into the clasp. I remembered the night I'd given it to him, how he'd said he'd treasure it always. Now it sparkled on her throat, catching the light like it was mocking me. My chest tightened, but I didn't let it show. I smiled at the investor and kept my posture straight, even though my hands trembled slightly. Across the room, Celine leaned close to Grant and whispered something that made him laugh. The sound felt cold, like a knife scraping against glass. People around them smiled, but I could see the cracks in their eyes. They all saw it too, the lie dressed up as love. I finished my drink, placed the empty glass on the nearest tray, and smiled. I didn't storm out. I didn't cry or confront anyone. I just stood there quietly, holding the weight of everything I'd lost, and thought to myself that when my turn came, I would not need to shout. Quiet revenge always lands the hardest. After the gala, something in me changed. I stopped trying to understand Grant and started thinking clearly for the first time in a long while. The sadness that had filled me slowly hardened into focus. I knew the man I had married no longer saw me as his partner. He saw me as someone he could dismiss. That was his mistake. He had forgotten that I wasn't just his wife. I was part of the foundation he stood on. For years, I had signed documents, reviewed contracts, and handled parts of the business when it was still small. I wasn't a bystander. I was an investor, a co-founder in everything but title. Grant liked to act like Hollister Innovations was his creation alone, but he had conveniently forgotten that I still owned 27% of it. My name sat on legal papers he hadn't thought about in years, and I made sure I kept every single one. Late one night, while he was out working, I sat at my desk and opened an old file box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were the original partnership agreements, share certificates, and signed amendments. Each paper was a piece of leverage he didn't know I still had. I read every line carefully, marking the ones that mattered. By the time the clock hit midnight, I knew I needed help, someone who understood how to use what I had. That's when I reached out to Eleanor Reese. She came recommended by an old client of mine, a woman who'd once walked away from a cheating husband twice her size and 5 times her ego. Eleanor was calm, clever, and quiet. We met in a small coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind of place no one would look for me. She listened as I explained everything, how I helped start the company, the papers I'd saved, and the way Grant was pushing me out of my own life. When I finished, she leaned back and smiled slightly. "You hold the power, Harper," she said. "He just doesn't know it yet." Those words stayed with me. Power. I hadn't felt it in years. I'd spent so long walking on eggshells, trying to protect a marriage that had already died. But now I realized I had something stronger than his money or his charm. I had the truth on paper. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor helped me review every clause and plan every move. I said nothing to Grant. He was too busy organizing his company's grand 10th anniversary celebration, a $17 million party that would show off his success. He called it a milestone event. I called it a distraction. He thought I was being supportive when I nodded and smiled as he talked about the guest list and the caterers. In reality, I was letting him build his own stage. He didn't know it yet, but that party would be his moment of glory, and my moment of goodbye. By the time the lights came on that night, everything he believed he owned would already be slipping out of his hands. The night of the party felt like a performance, and I was the unwanted extra on his perfect stage. The mansion shimmered with chandeliers, the air thick with expensive perfume and the sound of an orchestra playing soft jazz. Every inch of the house was dressed in imported roses, the kind that looked beautiful but had no scent. Grant had spared no expense. He called it a celebration of success. To me, it felt like a monument to everything he had become, loud, polished, and hollow. Guests filled the ballroom, glasses of champagne in hand, laughing at jokes they didn't really understand. They all came to be seen, to stand near the man of the hour. Grant moved through the crowd like a politician, charming everyone who could still benefit him. And then there was Celine, his perfect accessory for the evening. She wore a gown I instantly recognized from a boutique I used to love, a place I'd stopped visiting because it reminded me of who I was before all of this. The dress was pale gold, shimmering under the lights, fitted so precisely it seemed made for her. She didn't even try to hide her place in his life anymore. She stood beside him when photographers asked for pictures, smiling like she'd earned the right to stand in that spot. I kept to the edges of the room, quietly watching. I greeted people politely, nodded when spoken to, and held my glass steady. I refused to let anyone see what I was feeling. I'd already decided this was the last time I'd let either of them make me feel small. When it was time for Grant's toast, he climbed onto the small stage, microphone in hand. The crowd went silent, waiting for him to deliver one of his carefully crafted speeches. He thanked his partners, investors, and team. He even thanked the caterers for making the night perfect. But not once did he mention me. Not once did he acknowledge the woman who stood by him when all he had was a borrowed desk and a dream. People noticed. A few shifted uncomfortably, glancing in my direction, but Grant didn't care. He smiled that same fake smile he'd perfected over the years, and Celine beamed beside him like the queen of the night. When he stepped off the stage, she leaned close to him, her voice soft but clear enough for nearby guests to hear. "Some people just don't belong in this world anymore," she said, her tone light, as if it were a joke. But it wasn't. It was meant for me. A few people laughed awkwardly, following Grant's lead. He didn't correct her. He didn't even look my way. That was the moment something in me went quiet, not from pain, but from resolve. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed my glass down on a silver tray and walked toward the door. The sound of the orchestra faded behind me, replaced by the soft click of my heels on the marble floor. I didn't look back once. The next morning, while he was still probably sleeping off his success, I sat in Eleanor's office. The sunlight streamed through her window as I signed the final papers. My hand was steady, my heart calm. The party had been his victory lap, but for me, it marked the beginning of his fall. The weeks after the party felt strangely calm. Grant was busy traveling and showing off his success, completely unaware that everything he had built was about to slip through his hands. I spent those days in quiet meetings with Eleanor, finalizing every small detail. Every paper was checked twice, every signature placed with care. There were no arguments, no shouting matches, just calm, deliberate action. I didn't want revenge in the form of chaos. I wanted precision. My 27% stake in Hollister Innovations had grown into something powerful. For years, Grant had ignored it, assuming I'd never use it against him. He saw me as emotional, not strategic. That made this easier. Eleanor connected me with a private buyer, someone who had been watching Grant's company from the sidelines for a long time. His name was Mason Cade. He was sharp, collected, and had once been Grant's partner before their split turned into a bitter rivalry. When Mason and I met, he didn't bother pretending. "He burned me years ago," he said simply. "You're giving me a chance to even the score." I didn't care about his motives. All I needed was a clean transaction and silence. Mason agreed immediately. We kept the deal hidden under layers of confidentiality. Not even Grant's board would see it coming. The day I signed the sale documents, the office was quiet except for the faint scratching of my pen. Eleanor slid the last page toward me, and when it was done, she leaned back with a satisfied look. "It's official," she said. "You're free." The weight that left my shoulders felt heavier than I expected. For years, that company had been my life, my investment, my pride, and my prison. Now it was gone, and so was he, at least in every way that mattered. The deal closed smoothly. No headlines, no leaks. Mason's firm took over the shares through a holding company, and within days, the balance of power inside Hollister Innovations shifted. Board members began asking questions. Investors grew nervous. Rumors spread that Mason was planning a hostile takeover. Grant found out on a Tuesday morning. I knew because he called me 12 times within an hour. I watched the phone light up on my kitchen counter, his name flashing again and again. I didn't answer. I just sat there, drinking my coffee, listening to the silence between rings. Later that day, one of his assistants left me a voicemail by accident. Her voice was shaky as she said, "He's furious. He's blaming everyone. The board is meeting early." I deleted it without listening to the rest. Over the next few days, news traveled fast through business circles. Hollister Innovations' stock began to slide. Investors pulled out. Mason made his move quietly, buying more shares through intermediaries until he had enough to challenge Grant's control. I didn't celebrate, but there was a small sense of peace knowing justice didn't always have to be loud. Grant kept calling, sometimes late at night, his voice breaking on the voicemails. "Harper, please. We need to talk. You don't understand what you've done." But I did. I understood perfectly. For once, I wasn't the woman waiting for him to come home or for things to get better. I was the woman who finally walked away and let the truth do the work. So when the last call came and went unanswered, I turned off my phone, placed it face down, and let the silence remind me that I didn't owe him anything. Not an explanation, not forgiveness, and certainly not another chance. It was a grey morning when Grant showed up at my door. I hadn't seen him in weeks, though I'd heard enough about what was happening to his company. The stock had fallen, 2 investors had pulled out, and the board was demanding answers. He had gone from the man everyone admired to the man everyone avoided. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. His usual sharp suit was replaced with wrinkled clothes, and his eyes were red and tired. His hair, once perfectly styled, looked like he'd run his hands through it 100 times. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He just stood there, breathing hard, like he wasn't sure what to say first. Then the words came out in a rush. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice cracking. "You destroyed my life, Harper. Everything I worked for, gone because of you." I leaned against the door frame, keeping my tone even. "You destroyed us long before this, Grant. I just signed the paperwork." He froze, blinking as if he hadn't expected me to sound so calm. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do you even know what you've done? You sold your shares to Mason Cade. He's gutting the company. You've ruined everything." I folded my arms. "No, Grant. You ruined everything. You were so busy chasing your ego that you forgot who built it with you. You forgot me." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. His shoulders slumped, and all the fight seemed to drain out of him. "Celine's gone," he said quietly, almost like a confession. "She left when the money started drying up. She said she couldn't handle the stress." I didn't react. I had expected that. Someone like Celine was never there for love. She was there for the lights, the parties, the attention. The moment those things disappeared, she'd find someone else who could give them to her. Grant looked lost, like a man who had finally seen the truth too late. "I thought you'd understand," he said softly. "After everything we've been through, I thought you'd still be on my side." I looked at him for a long moment. This was the same man who once made me laugh until my sides hurt, who once told me he couldn't breathe without me. Now he was standing on my doorstep, broken by his own greed. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for him, but I couldn't. That part of me was gone. "I was on your side, Grant," I said quietly, "until you made sure there was no place left for me to stand." His mouth opened like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. I could see the anger in his eyes fading into something that looked like regret. Maybe for the first time, he understood what he'd lost, not just the company, but the person who had helped him build it. He took a step back, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "I didn't think you'd actually leave me," he said, almost whispering. I gave him a small, steady look. "You never thought I'd have the strength to." Then I closed the door slowly, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the handle, listening to the silence on the other side. I didn't feel anger or sadness, just relief. For the first time in years, I was free, and he was finally left to face the emptiness he had created. Months passed quietly after I closed that door. For the first time in years, my days didn't revolve around waiting for someone to come home or pretending everything was fine. I packed up the few things that still mattered to me and left the city behind. Portland felt like a good place to start again, far enough from the past, close enough to who I wanted to be. I found a small apartment near the river, with big windows and soft light that filled the rooms every morning. It wasn't grand, but it was peaceful. I spent the first few weeks just learning how to live without noise, no endless phone calls, no fake smiles, no parties that meant nothing. The silence was strange at first, but then it became comforting. Eventually, I decided to start my own business again. I called it Haven and Hollow, a design firm that focused on creating spaces for women rebuilding their lives, divorcees, widows, anyone who needed a fresh start. I poured myself into the work, using every bit of experience I had. Each project reminded me that I still had purpose, that I could create something beautiful out of what was broken. The women I worked with often shared their stories, and in listening to them, I found pieces of myself again. Every now and then, Grant's name would appear in the business section of the news. The articles grew darker with time: lawsuits from investors, firings, financial troubles. Hollister Innovations was shrinking fast. The company that once symbolized success now stood as a warning. People who used to praise him turned their backs, and the empire we built together started crumbling from the inside. I didn't feel satisfaction reading about it. I thought I would, but I didn't. There was a time when I wanted him to feel every ounce of the pain he caused me. But watching him fall didn't bring the peace I expected. Instead, it just confirmed what I already knew, that he had done this to himself. My part in it was simply letting go. Sometimes I'd think about how different things could have been if he had chosen love over pride, truth over appearances. But I didn't linger on those thoughts. The past was heavy, and I was finally learning to travel light. I stopped checking the news after a while. His downfall wasn't my story anymore. In the evenings, I'd sit by the window of my small office, sketching plans while the sun went down. I'd look at the women whose homes I helped design, women who smiled again after losing everything, and I'd see pieces of my own healing reflected in theirs. That's when I understood that revenge had never been the real victory. Destroying him would never have rebuilt me. What healed me was taking back control of my life, piece by piece, and finding peace in the quiet spaces where pain used to live. Peace, I learned, felt far better than payback ever could. It was a quiet morning when the letter arrived, tucked between bills and flyers in my mailbox. The handwriting stopped me right away. I would have known it anywhere. Grant's writing had always been neat, careful, almost too precise, like everything he did. For a moment, I just stood there, holding the envelope, staring at my name written in his familiar hand. I thought about throwing it away unopened. But curiosity, or maybe closure, made me take it inside. I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I now spent peaceful mornings sketching designs or drinking coffee with no one to answer to. The envelope was thin, just one page inside. I unfolded it slowly, half expecting apologies or excuses, but it was neither. The words were simple, written in that same careful script. You were always the foundation. I just forgot who built the walls. That was all. No, I'm sorry. No, please forgive me. Just a single line that said more than 100 speeches ever could. I read it twice, then set it down beside my coffee cup. For the first time, I didn't feel anger or sadness, just a strange kind of understanding. He had finally realized the truth, but far too late for it to matter. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. The chapter was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. The woman who had once waited for him to change no longer existed. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, stronger and quieter than before. That evening, I walked down to the beach near my home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and pink, and the waves rolled in soft and steady. I slipped off my shoes and let the cold water touch my feet. The horizon stretched endlessly in front of me, calm and wide, and for the first time in years, I felt free of every weight he'd ever placed on me. I thought about how much of my life I had spent trying to prove my worth, to him, to his world, to the version of success we built together. And now, standing there with the wind in my hair and the sand beneath my feet, I realized I didn't need any of it. I had already won, not by destroying him, but by reclaiming myself. I looked out at the fading light and smiled to myself. The past no longer hurt. It was just a story I had survived, a memory that no longer had power over me. The waves carried that thought away, soft and sure, until it disappeared completely. Sometimes the best revenge isn't watching them fall apart. It's standing in your own peace, knowing they'll never have that again. I turned back toward home, the sunset warm on my face, and with each step, I felt the last pieces of the past drift quietly away.